Hello, 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 everyone. Happy Friday. Oh, yes. How are you? How was your week? Yeah, mine was good actually. It seems to be everything seems to just be flying by. It's supposed to be the lazy days of summer here, but yeah, that's not happening. And tomorrow I have a busy day filled with Dumb and Her activities, which is really exciting. Actually, I'm looking forward to working all of those. And I'm trying to ignore my phone, which is going a bit crazy because one of the groups that I'm a part of here in Dumb and Her is having a big conversation about a bunch of stuff, which, leaving it all behind. Anyway, but we're here. We're here together now to talk about a new paper. There are so many new developments happening in this world, and for me, it gets really exciting to bring all of these. How do I say this? Let me rephrase. Let me go back. Let me go back. Back. So over the last few days, I went through and I was updating. So when I started doing plant consciousness commentary, which was now over a year plus ago, I actually started inside of the naturally conscious community. As you know, I have this online ecosystem. We have this online ecosystem, to be honest, and this beautiful online ecosystem that allows us to have this sacred space, this safe space for us to explore all things plant, human, and other kin. And so when I started doing the plant consciousness commentary, which back then was called plant intelligence commentary, and the name has switched a few times, I did it all inside of NCC. I was live streaming in NCC. Then at one point I decided to move it over, and then I would kind of like periodically share it on YouTube, or I would share it on Facebook or things like that. And then at some point I decided that it would be better to do it on YouTube and moved it all over to YouTube. And I started to get really, you know how it is, you get organized as time goes by, right? You first write up a little kind of show notes page inside of NCC. Then I started to write show notes pages inside of on my website. And so I had a hodgepodge of things all over the place. So I decided to go back onto my website and publish all of the old plant consciousness commentary. It still points to the naturally conscious community because that's where it lives, but it's all there. And so you can go into the naturally conscious community, into Sprout discussions, and into the programs and replays, and you can see every single paper I've ever talked about. Or you can also now find them on my website. So while I was doing this, it was really fun because it was really interesting to see the progression of all the papers. Remember, when we started in in order, let's say it that way, right? We started doing this from the perspective of let's try to go to the earliest. I mean, it's not going to be the earliest, but like the earliest major paper connected to the intelligence of plants and, really the birth of plant neurobiology, that controversial term. And then let's take that going forward. So there was so many papers on consciousness, arguments between human neurobiologists and plant neurobiologists, the argument on the terms. And then from there's been this expansion. So it was really interesting and really fun for me to go back to all of those and go through them in detail because it gave me an opportunity to really understand kind of how we've gotten to where we are. Because the paper we're going to work on today is actually an evolution of all of these conversations, a really important evolution because these papers that I was talking to you about start with the birth of plant neurobiology and really go through the creation or the beginnings of what's called critical plant studies. So really going into the plant humanities. So we're talking, like I said, from 2006 to pretty much where we are today. This particular paper that we're going to go into goes even a step further, and it's going to start talking into vegetal geography. Now, there are several reasons why vegetal geography is important, but just the same as we've touched on topics of vegetal performance, we've talked on queer ecology, we've talked on many different aspects connected to these plant humanities and to the entire concept of critical plant studies. Vegetal geography, which we have touched on before, this isn't the first paper on vegetal geography, but it is an important one where the author, Anna M. Lawrence, starts to go into why this exploration of vegetal geography is important. Where does it come from, and why is it significant in the context of where we are today? I always think I can have my hair down when I do this, and I really can't. It's first of all, it's hot here, so but besides being hot, I just don't want it to get in the way. It's like hold on, sorry. Anyway, so moving it out of my face because I want you to be able to see me. Anyway, so this paper really goes into, it says it in the title, Listening to Plants, Conversations Between Critical Plant Studies and Vegetal Geography. So here we're really kind of getting into a next wave of evolution, which is the part that to me is super exciting because it's showing how this conversation with plants and of plants, soon to be with plants, we're actually going to be moving, because up until now, everything we have been going through has been talking about plants with agency, with intelligence, and in some cases with consciousness, depending on which of the papers we've been reviewing. But it has been looking at plants as persons. But plants have still been kind of outside of the realm of the conversation. Every once in a while, like when we were reading Natasha Meyer's papers, you get somebody who starts to talk about with plants, but still the majority are of plants. Plants with agency, plants with personhood, plants that are intelligent, plants that have consciousness, but still of plants, not with plants. It is only probably, we're about in 2021, we're only looking at late to that, probably going into 2022, that we start to see more discussions with plants. And actually, if you listen to this week's podcast, episode 69 with Amanda Nicole, daughter of Tulip Poplar, you will hear her talking about her Entosophy, I think that's the way she pronounces it, project, which was a project where she went to have conversations with many different types of trees that Tulip Poplar was like, go talk to the trees themselves, because these are not the types of conversations that most humans are having with trees. So these are the kinds of conversations we're having inside of the naturally conscious community, which is why I keep asking you and inviting you to come in and join us, because in the naturally conscious community, we are starting to have these conversations that is not just about the plants, but it is with the plants. Hence why we've done, plant communication workshops, why we have Reconnect with the Plant Kingdom, which also is the signature course that talks about how to create a two-way conversation. These are the tools, but in the Sprout discussions and in our various programs, whether we're talking about the writing group or whether we're talking about the book club, it is about bringing the plants into everyday life. It is about asking the plants to be our partners in the different projects that we're working on. And as we go expanding and thinking about politics and thinking about geography and thinking about my work life and thinking about my interactions with others, thinking about things on a macro stage and thinking about things on a micro stage, how do we bring plants into this conversation with intention, and with the intention of being our partners in this? This is really a big piece of it, and it's super important for where it is that we want to go going forward. So to me, papers like this are exciting because it's starting to show the breadth as we're starting to get wider into the conversations, where plants are now no longer relegated just to plant biology, plant neurobiology, but like we saw last week, also we take the science with the Balushka and Mancuso paper, and then take it in to every day through the arts with Giovanni Aloy. So we're really at a very critical point in the progression of plants as persons and plants as partners. We're not there yet 100%, but we're getting closer. And in order for this, we have plants as models, we have plants as mentors, we have plants as measures, but plants as partners, which is a big, big aspect of the naturally conscious community. It's a big part of our conversation, and it's something that we work on a lot. How do we bring plants into our conversations, even the mundane conversations of everyday life, in order to understand how to build better, how to build in union, how to build more connected? And these papers start to show us that this trend is starting to shift from plants in botany and in as gardens and as objects, and plants as, oh, wait a minute, let me look at this in many different contexts. Okay. So this is why, to me, plants like, papers like this are so important, and why it's, for me, especially as a mentor, and especially as a life coach, why is this so important? Because when we work with plants closely as partners, not just mentors and models also, but as partners, now all of a sudden I'm able to activate and connect to parts of myself that I have not had access to. And I am able to more fully embody my authentic self. And that's going to change my relationships. It's going to improve the way I relate to others. It's going to change the decision-making process. It's going to help me be more confident in what it is that I have to do, and to tap into my evolutive nature, my aspects of how it is that I am supposed to evolve in this world, to really move into a different level, a different flow, you might say, that is me operating as a being of nature inside of a context that is natural, regardless of whether or not it's, artificial in a lot of aspects. Let's not even get into that, but more natural from the perspective of the way that I flow and the way that I experience life. So it brings a lot of peace of mind and clarity, and my ability to really work as a being of nature and create as a being of nature. So you can see why, to me, this is really exciting, that we're starting to get this amplification and this expansion on these topics, because it is when we as humans are connecting back, that plant reawakening is happening more. Our plant blindness is starting to kind of fizzle away. And if you saw one of the posts that I just recently put into the naturally conscious community, I was talking about how, even in the 1840s, there was already discussion that plant blindness and soul blindness were connected. We are not able to see our full selves as a soul, as a body that is beyond our physical body, because we're not able to see the plants. And there's this reciprocal exchange happen there. If you haven't seen that post, go check out the post. If you're on my email list, you would have gotten an email about it. Go check it out. It's fascinating, fascinating article. So here we are today. We are going to talk, let's jump into this plant paper so that we can get this ball rolling. I never realize how long they are sometimes. And so let's get this started. All right. Let's get over here. Let's get our paper. Let's put it into the right view. Is it this one? I always forget which one it is. Yeah, this one's it. Okay. So, and then that's not the right view. Let's make myself a little bit smaller. So this is a paper called Listening to Plants, Conversations Between Critical Plant Studies and Vegetal Geography. Remember, I told you this is kind of the introduction of geography, like a vegetal geography as a specialization. And this is by Anna M. Lawrence at the Department of Geography in the University of Cambridge. And so let me make this a little bit bigger. Let me make myself a little bit smaller. Let me get my comment section up and running. If you're here, if you're watching live, hello. If you are coming here just, to watch the replay, we love you. Thank you so much for coming. Please, though, write a comment. Where are you coming from? Who are you? Where are you? I want to get to know you. I'm trying to create more of a community dynamic going here. So it takes me a minute, but I'll get there. It's just one section at a time. So let's get into this paper. Can I make this even bigger? Just curious. Kind of. I don't know if that's better. We'll try it. Let's see. Let's see if this works. All right. Here's the abstract. Attention to plant life is currently flourishing across the social sciences and humanities. Isn't that the truth? I made a tea about an hour ago and I just forgot about it. which normally would bother me because, of course, you want your tea nice and hot, but it's so hot outside that it's actually perfect because now it's the perfect temperature. So luckily I made it. I took out because I only steep it for a certain period of time, and I took that out and I just let it sit there. So now I get to enjoy cold tea, which is actually really good. Wouldn't have worked for my matcha this morning, though. That wouldn't have been good. Okay. This paper introduces recent work in the informal subdiscipline of vegetal geography. And we're going to find out what vegetal geography is, placing it into conversation with the transdisciplinary field of critical plant studies. Now, I want to stop for a second because this word transdisciplinary is one that I worked with a woman back when I was working a few years ago as the communications manager for a nonprofit that was working on EU-based projects doing biomimicry education. And the woman who was one of the founders of the organization had done her PhD on transdisciplinary cooperation and such. So she hammered this home. And I find it a word that is so important and yet so infrequently used in the correct context. We tend to use interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary is different. Interdisciplinary is basically, I have lots of disciplines. Transdisciplinary is like when I build up a team where everybody has their specialization. And so everybody's field gets put into it in different ways. So, one person in a biomimicry project, we see this a lot. You have the architect with the designer, with the plant botanist or plant physiology specialist, with, the, ecology specialist, like all of these, that's a transdisciplinary team. And the reason I say this is because this is the future. The future are transdisciplinary teams. This is that feminine going, me, I switch between science and engineering and mathematics and then spirituality and esoterics because all of it is important. And transdisciplinary is really the feminine energy coming in much stronger. The idea that our teams are made up of multiple functions of individuals with their specializations who are all important and who we support in the work that they're doing. And I love that we're seeing more and more of this come in. So I am going to be using transdisciplinary again, much more often. So transdisciplinary field of critical plant studies, a broad framework for reevaluating plants and human-plant interactions informed by principles of agency, ethics, cognition, and language. I want you to remember those terms. Agency in the sense of plants are agents. They are active agents in their life. They are aware of what is happening and are making choices. That choices word really does nail a few people. So many people struggle with the idea that plants make conscious choices, but let's just go with it for now. Ethics, which is an entire field that is more connected to the human side of it. Once we recognize agency of plants, what are the ethical considerations that need to change? What is it about the rules, the morals, the ethics that we have created that were based more on the idea of plant as object and not plant as active person? Once plant becomes aware person, what changes? This is important. And this is a field that, in my opinion, we are just on we hear it about AI ethics, but we don't really hear about plant ethics very often, except in the legal realm. On the legal realm, we start to hear some things. So I think it is going to be the legal field, going back to the transdisciplinary, that is going to push some of these ethical considerations, but it is going to touch everything. And I think we can't just rely that it's going to be only in the legal field, because when we think about construction and building and agriculture, there's a lot of ethical considerations for us to reconsider now. Cognition, we've talked so much about here, so I don't need to go there, and language, which we've only touched on a few papers that really step into the concept of language as an expansion of what we think of today. Because today we think of language in the sense of what I'm doing right now. I'm speaking to you. But that's not all language. Language has lots of other things. I give off pheromones. That's a language. Plants give off chemicals. That's a language. There's electrical signals. There are so many other ways in which language interacts, especially when you're thinking about between other species, between other kin. There are many different forms of language. And again, we've touched on a few papers here, so you can go back and look through them, that really starts to just give us a hint of what's possible. But this is going to, again, touch into ethics and so many other aspects. I explore three key themes of interest to multi-species scholars looking to attend more closely to vegetal life, namely, one, plant otherness, two, plant ethics. Remember, I was saying, listen to that. And three, plant human attunements, in the hope of encouraging greater cross pollination between more than human geography and critical plant studies. So, here is the quote. Lots of people hear plants sing, though not necessarily in the audible registers you might anticipate. And this is from Natasha Meyer's 2018. I have to see which paper it is, but 2018. That might be the plant sensing paper that we've gone through. Introduction. What does it mean to hear a plant? When being attentive to vegetal life, we look closely, we taste, we smell, we touch. Perhaps we hear the rustle of leaves in the wind, or the groaning of a branch, or the rattle of seeds in a poppy head. But to hear is not just to perceive sounds through our ears. It is also to listen with attention and understanding, to give ear to. As Robin Wall Kimmerer makes clear, plants may not speak our language, but their eloquence can be found in their material growth and the ways in which they live. It has been well established that plants have long been lurking in the proverbial pavement cracks of more than human geography in favor of the animal. As well as restating this call, this paper explores the recent contributions made under the loosely defined umbrella of vegetal geography, placing them in conversation with the blossoming interdisciplinary field of critical plant studies. The theoretical insights provided by CPS, Critical Plant Studies, hold much potential for more than human geographers concerned with unpicking the specifics of multi-species entanglements and listening to the planty subjects within them. Whilst vegetal geographers have much to contribute in the realm, in the return, both methodologically and in rooting plant theory firmly in context of place. Jill was asking about where is the soul blindness and plant blindness post. You can find it inside the Naturally Conscious community under Sprout Discussions. It has a beautiful image of this white flower. It's actually more of an X-ray of a flower with a black background. You can't miss it. Just go in and you'll see it. It's probably only like 2 or 3 posts back. In recent decades, animal geographers have done much to challenge the ontological and epistemological underpinnings of the discipline of human geography, demanding a theoretical reevaluation of agency and the co-production of space, what it means to be human, and the biopolitical management of life. Biopolitical management of life. However, interrogations of life which refer only to animal bodies, whilst valuable, can only take us so far. Increasingly, with emerging multi-species scholarship, the gates of bios are being thrown open to all living creatures, plants, fungi, animals, and microorganisms. And we saw this in the book Biocivilizations that we read in the Plant Wisdom Book Club. What was that, 2 books ago now? And there we really stepped deeper into this concept of biocivilization. So civilizations created by different organisms, especially plants and fungi and animals and microorganisms and bacteria. He loved bacteria. The author loved bacteria. But this gave us a really deeper understanding of the fact that there are many other kinds of politics going on, not just human politics. There are many types of civilizations going on, not just human civilizations, that interact all together and do many of the same functions, from medicine to caretaking to, road construction, to all different aspects that we think of when we're thinking about what it is to create in a location. There are also invitations from new materialist thought, object-oriented ontology, and indigenous scholarship to consider the agency of inanimate objects, mountains, bottles, and books. Whilst these theoretical perspectives are highly generative, there is a risk of fast-forwarding from the animal, in particular those animals most close, comfortable, and charismatic, to absolute ontological entanglement with all matter, without pausing to allow fungi, bacteria, insects, or plants time to root themselves in our theoretical and ethical imaginations. And this is something that I do want to say because I have talked about it, but I don't really talk about it as much as I feel like I probably should. But there are times when people used to ask me this question all the time when I was doing the music of the plants, because when I was working really deeply with the music of the plants, we did discuss the fact that that people would come up to me to ask me about, well, what happens when, is what we're listening to the plants in the perspective of plants music as plants. And of course, the music of the plants device has an algorithm similar to the difference between me doing throat singing versus me playing a guitar, right? Through the guitar, I have to constrain my performance through this instrument. And I become very adept at the instrument, but the instrument has its constraints, right? The instrument has intervals and strings that allow me to only make certain notes, and then I can pluck them in different ways and do different aspects, but there are limitations, right? So, and I used to tell people that we have to understand that because this whole concept of plant music is still so new, it's so different from our perspectives, and it opens up many considerations that we had never given ourselves the opportunity to even consider, such as plant awareness and plant agency. It is absolutely, in my opinion, normal or probably even favorable for us to go through steps where first we ask the plants, who are more malleable and more adaptive than we are, to play through a human type instrument. And with time, we will then, working closely with plants, discover what is there, how do kin make music, and what does that word music mean to kin? But we need to go through steps because there's so much in our mental conditioning. There's so much in our rivers that are of understanding that are set, our own ontological kind of definition so clearly laid out in these boxes that music is this thing and humans are this thing and plants are this thing, that because this is going to break it all open, we need to give space for that. And the only way to really give space to that is by going one step at a time. So do I always love the fact that, we're still talking about plants in the perspective of it? No. But do I think that we can move from agency to, okay, plants are alive, therefore we cannot kill a plant no matter what? We don't understand the in-betweens of what that means. So I think that this type of step that we're talking about here, right, where going from where we are today, which is really recognizing those beings that are closest to us, like dogs and cats and such, and going to the full entanglement of agency of everything, rocks and, and even what happens when something is human made, like, I don't know, a steel beam. I think we need to go by steps, because if not, we run the risk of, I just feel like we run the risk of going too far and not really understanding, like not learning what it is that is truly necessary in the world. We're really just then going from one extreme to the other, and that doesn't serve anybody. Hopefully that makes sense, but feel free to ask me questions. You can just pop something into the chat if that doesn't make any sense. Okay. The wealth of diversity within the plant kingdom demands its own theoretical approaches, allied with but not tied to those of the animal. This is kind of what I was talking about. There is value to be found in stopping to smell the roses, given that our ecological survival on this planet likely rests upon collaboration between humans and plants. Despite the relative neglect of plants within the discipline, there are currents of lively geographical scholarship which are taking plants seriously in a wide variety of contexts, including agriculture, urban space, foraging, and biosecurity. Many of these approaches remain, however, somewhat fragmented. This paper explores this body of work and contributes to debates around the possible existence of a vegetal geography, arguing that while formal institutionalization of the subdiscipline might be unnecessary, it might be productive for vegetal geographers to do what? To situate themselves more firmly within the broader landscape of critical plant studies. And again, this is why I was talking about when we're going from a paradigm that we know that doesn't necessarily work or is incorrect to an unknown paradigm, it's tempting to try to jump. And there are times when taking a leap is going to be important. But at the same time, there are also times when I think it's important for us to go one step at a time. And I think that this is a case of where I can see the benefit of going one step and um and just understanding better what the considerations are rather than going hog wild all in one direction. Critical plant studies is an interdisciplinary and umbelliferous field. Umbelliferous. I love the words that we discover in papers. Umbelliferous field, which sits betwixt and between the environmental humanities, plant sciences, art and aesthetics, philosophy and ethics. And we've seen papers from all of these. We've seen papers from all of these, which I think is one of the most fascinating pieces of the critical plant studies because it touches on such a wide breadth of different fields. Emerging in the early 2010s, CPS provides a broad framework for reevaluating plants, their representations, and human-plant interactions, guided by questions of agency, ethics, cognition, and language. Remember, earlier I was describing all this and I told you, hold these definitions because this is important for us to have. Literature within CPS is wide-ranging, but coheres around the imperatives to carefully reassess the specificities of plant behavior and assert the centrality of plants to human life and thought. Some vegetal geographers have already been actively engaging with and contributing to critical plant studies. And many more have been inspired by the work of these geographers. But there is potential for greater cross-pollination between the two fields. After introducing vegetal geography and critical plant studies, I explore three critical themes from within the literature. Plants pose a challenge to Western animal-centric ontologies. A challenge just to that? No, there's a lot more challenge. There's to human exceptionalism, to our current political climate, to our understanding of how to create. Oh my God, there's so many different challenges. Their otherness, prompting a redefinition of certain terms and concepts, as explored in Section 4, which focuses on navigating the tensions in tracing similarities, differences across kingdoms. Section 5 steps back to consider the ethical standing of plants and the implications in terms of diet, racial capitalism, and non-human labor, asking how questions of human justice might be balanced with a plant multi-species or elemental ethics. Now, this is going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to Section 5. Finally, Section 6 unites theory with practice in elaborating on a variety of attunements to plant life deployed within critical plant studies and vegetal geography, from experimentation with art and film to archival and participatory research. Whilst not exhaustive, these three areas will, I hope, introduce ongoing debates and lay out some of the more fruitful lines of confluence and conversation between critical plant studies and geography. What might you hear when a plant sings? Interesting. This is already interesting. Okay, despite their central role in founding of geography as a discipline, plants lingered chiefly in the domain of the biogeographer until the early 2000s. Within human geography, plant bodies have been typically obscured, made invisible by their categorization of undifferentiated collectives, as often is the case of crops, or backgrounded as environment or ecosystem. Talking about language, I think one of the big areas of language that has to change, is our concept of the word environment. So I feel like it's super important for us to redefine the word environment, because environment today is like everything else that's I don't want to say not important because we do recognize that the environment is important, but the environment is almost very still object like. I think environment has to change, nature has to. These are two terms that I think is really important for us to evolve in order to get a broader understanding of our own place in the natural world. So everything around natural nature is way too constrained. It's way too constrained, and I think we're beating ourselves up because we're trying to expand our thinking, but these words pull us back into old paradigms. I mean, even nature with a capital N versus with a lowercase n. Yeah. If you have ideas for this, I'm all open for them because I think this is really important. Okay. Plants have therefore tended to be dealt with as living objects rather than as active subjects, reinforcing the nature culture divide. Agreed. And that's what I'm talking about, right? The idea that we look at plants as subject, as object almost, rather than an active participant. It's, yeah, we need to change this. In their 2009 progress report on emerging human plant geographies, Head and Atchison drew together material from the early 2000s, which started to look more closely at plants, notably in the context of foods, gardens, and biosecurity. Since then, several noteworthy theoretical themes have emerged within the work, which might loosely be grouped together under the umbrella of vegetal geography: plant temporality, agency, care, and the everyday. The peculiar and multiple temporalities of plants raise the question as to whether the broad classification of plant even makes sense as an analytical category. Geographers have interrogated the distinctive temporalities of different plants as they shape people, place, and industry, from the growth cycles of sugarcane in Barbadian breeding programs to the dwarfed apple rootstocks in the American Midwest, manipulated to allow for flexible specialization of variety among mid-scale growers. Vegetal time is central to exploring plant agency, determining how people inhabit landscapes with plants. I want to read that one again because I think this is an important phrase. Vegetal time is central to exploring plant agency, determining how people inhabit landscapes with plants, for example, those with beyond human timescales, such as arboreal time of sustainable guitar wood forestry in Gibson and Warren, or the complex temporalities folded within the body of a seed, which holds the capacity to make visible past landscapes and co-construct imagined futures within diverse communities. I'm taking a second because there is so much to take in here. If you're someone like me, right, where you're not really I don't have a lot of domestication with vegetal geography in the way that it's being spoken about, well, in geography in general. So I have several friends that work in these fields, and so I try to kind of understand and grasp it. So I'm trying to put into context the timescales and what we're talking about here and the conflicts which emerge with, again, the body of a seed, which holds the capacity to make visible past landscapes and co-construct imagined futures within diverse communities. I mean, that's a mind-blowing thought if you really sit down and you think about it for a second. As explored by Pellegrini and Baudry and Ernwine, the seasonality of certain perennial plants, both spontaneous and plants, can also challenge the timelessness of the city by reintroducing a life cycle to urban spaces. Vegetal temporalities pose a significant challenge to the strictures of the industrial capitalist time-space regime, inviting us to question what we would like to keep time with. Vegetal time is also central to geographical conceptualizations of relational plant agency, which focus on the human bodily attunements to plants as a means by which plant agency arises between bodies. which focuses on the human bodily attunements to plants as a means by which plant agency arises between bodies. Okay, I get it. Bryce's networked approach to grape harvesting resonates in particular with geographical work on edible plants. Geographers have increasingly been focusing on the specific affordances of the plants themselves as a means of tracing agency, notably within framing of plant performance in the context of weeds. As we call them wild plants here, not weeds. Weeds is derogatory. As pointed out by Cook and Lane, we are often more willing to ascribe agency to plants which are unwanted or exceed human control, such as the plants in their study which challenge exurban property boundaries as more than human territorial enactment. Much of the seminal work on plant agency within geography has drawn on empirical cases studies of invasive plant species, which we've gone through several of those papers too. And they're fascinating. But it is true, right? And why do you think it is, right? That when we're talking about why it, okay, here's a quiz for you, or it's not really a rhetorical question because I do believe that there is an answer. Why do you think it's easier to ascribe agency to a wild plant than it is to a cultivar or a domesticated plant or a crop, especially plant? You think about that one for a second. I don't think it's going to take you that long to figure out why, but why do you think it's easier to ascribe agency to those types of plants? I'm going to let you think about it, and I'll look for your answers in the chat. While invasives are excellent to think about questions of agency through, allowing for a clear elucidation of plant difference, they also risk leading to narrowed conceptualizations of planty agency, which are very active and antagonistic. That's one reason. One reason. Easy if it's an invasive. If we give them agency and we're like, they're out of control, then it's easier to like blame the plants. That's one. There is a danger of obscuring the less obvious instantiations of agency by less disruptive plant species, as well as drawing excessive attention to the plant actions which most closely resemble those of humans. It is important then to carefully ground conceptions of plant agency both in the shared differences of plants from other beings, as well as in the wide variety of planty cases and planty case studies which work through enormous diversity of vegetal beings. So do you think about why is it that it's easier to give agency and personhood to plants that are invasive and out of control? Okay, Michelle, you have to tell me more. It's the same difference between a dog and a plant and a wolf. Dog and a plant. Dog and a wolf. Tell me more. Tell me more. Because I'm sure you're on the right track. Tell me more. All right, I'm going to go a little bit further and then I'll answer and I'll stop and we'll see where we are. One further theme which vegetal geographers are closely engaging with is the effect of and care of building, especially on the work of Puig de la Bella Casa, I'm assuming. Choreographies of care in plants have notably been examined in agricultural context. Since care in agriculture, actually, no, hold on. I'm going to go back because I don't want to lose this thread. All right, folks. If we think of wild plants and we give them agency, it doesn't matter what the hell we do. They knew what they were doing, but look how they screwed this up. They hurt us, so we can eliminate them. Right? If my dog, I don't know, eats, actually, dog is seen as a partner. Okay, Michelle answered it. Dog is seen as a partner, someone who helps. A wolf is seen as the enemy that we must protect from. Exactly. Exactly. This is the reason why, if you remember, whenever we see any kind of like thing done against an animal that we consider to be domesticated, a pet or something of that nature, we are outraged. But if we round up all of the wolves and kill them, it's not a problem, because even though one evolved from the other, and even though both are intelligent beings with agency, Well, we have to do something to protect ourselves. It's all about the control or our lack of. That's it. That's it. It's all about the control or lack of. That is the central theme of all of this. And that's the reason why weeds, it's okay to say they have a mind of their own and we have to protect ourselves because they're going to hurt our plants. They're going to hurt what we're creating. And so it's okay to eradicate them. That's it. That's what we're talking about. That's in the end. That's what we're talking about. It's nuts. Okay, wait, where was I before? Choreographies of care for plants that have notably been examined in agricultural contexts. Since care in agriculture has typically been focused on animal bodies, these accounts take up the particular challenges presented by the alterity of plants, how agricultural workers learn to be affected by plants over time. In an ironic contradiction of industrial agriculture, these effective skills have been steadily devalued while simultaneously prized in new agricultural surveillance technologies developed to mimic the skills of close plant observation and care. Moving out of the farm and into the garden, Hannah Pitt challenges the proposition that connecting with nature through direct encounters with non-humans necessarily promotes ethical regard and care for them. Her proposed typology of relationships with non-humans is then based on a sort of hierarchy of ethical regard, from enemy to be killed to community member and dependent. It's all about control and our lack of, as Michelle was saying in the chat, because you all know. I'm just here repeating things for you, but you all know. You know. Her Pitt's stance echoes that of Ginn in his acknowledgement of the limits to care within everyday gardening practices and attention to the distance between species enacted through these spaces. There is an emphasis in these studies of effectivity and care as learnt capacities which must actively be cultivated through embodied encounters with plants, positioning plants both as guides and co-conspirators in spinning a vegetal ethics. Much of this work is therefore concerned with the mundane and the everyday, tracing close personal relationships between people and plants, notably within urban gardens and urban forests. As argued by Lang, there is an environmental imperative to learn more about the experiences of people and plants in everyday life in order to connect the social political aspects of how people live within these broader ecological impacts, particularly within cities. Alongside the marginally more established political ecology style approaches to plant life and geography, much of the work which I locate within the strand of the vegetal geography borrows from the environmental humanities, considering how the everyday stories we tell about plants can provide new insights into how vegetal life is experienced, imagined, and valued. As Perkins suggests, attitudes towards plant life, which may be perceived as common sense, are often anything but. This person, for instance, deconstructs the city of Baltimore's presentation of urban trees as an absolute good, arguing that the uneven focus on tree planting as opposed to everyday practices of care spatially reinforces Baltimore's history of racial segregation. Geographical studies into everyday plant-human relations, which pay careful attention to both the human aspects of the construction of space, race, class, gender, sexuality, as well as non-human, are well placed to ground some of the more theoretical plant studies work in real world. This brief review is, of course, by no means exhaustive. Other important strands of vegetal geography, some of which shall be explored further below, include recent work on vegetal labor, biosecurity, and indigenous knowledge. The purpose of this section has been to draw together a literature which, as yet, lacks a coherent, subdisciplinary identity. Within academic conference circuits, discussions have been occurring as to whether vegetal geography ought to be more concretely institutionalized as a subdiscipline in order to assist its flourishing. On the one hand, a separate vegetal geography field could be considered reflective of the restrictive projects of hierarchical classification, which multi-species work tries to problematize, where might geographies of microbes or fungi sit in relation to those of animals and plants. It would indeed be counterintuitive for vegetal geography to take on a disciplinary structure akin to that of animal geography, taking a cue from multi-species ethnography. There needs to remain a theoretical fluidity between animals, plants, humans, microbes, and the abiotic world in order to reflect the complexity of our entangled relations. However, actually, before I get there, this is the kind of conversation that is the reason why I named the naturally conscious community the naturally conscious community instead of naming it the plant conscious community. I've been asked this several times, and I have to admit I don't really say it out loud very much, not because of anything, but just because it just doesn't. It people who know. But the reason I called it the naturally conscious community because I knew for me, plants have been my gateway. They can help me understand that the world is bigger than the human world that I lived in before I started working with plants. And at the same time, plants tell me every single day that an ecosystem is made up of more than just plants. So for me, the naturally conscious community was the title that helped me understand that this is about becoming conscious of the fact that I am nature and that nature is everything around me, biotic and abiotic. And therefore, plants are my mentors and models. So they can help me more than any other kind of being, but they are by no means the only beings that I work with. And I wanted that to be the case for everybody. I didn't want to call it the plant conscious community or the plant blah, 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 whatever, or the vegetal community, because I did not want our final goal. Remember I told you about steps? We were talking about this earlier, how I was saying that everything happens in steps. For me, my plant awakening led me to my natural awakening, to my understanding of my true nature, to working with my clients to help them really embody whomever they are. And some of them are animal lovers, and some are plant lovers, and some are rock lovers. And, I've worked with crystals, and some work instead with all kinds of different aspects. And that's all great, because whatever it is, whatever being takes you out of your human-centric world is awesome. And naturally conscious means I am aware. I am aware that I am a being of nature and I operate as a being of nature. I just happen to find that plants are better models and mentors for me, but that does not mean that they are the only models and mentors. And I welcome all kinds of models and mentors. So I think that that's what she's trying to say here, which is it would be counterintuitive. Sometimes we try to create these disciplines like plant, whatever, like in the neurobiology, right? When you study neurobiology, if I just study neurobiology, it's assumed that I study human neurobiology. Maybe I get into animal neurobiology, but it's definitely not plant neurobiology because we have these other titles. Why we have phyto, blah, 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 why we have plants, such and such. It's not. It's intelligence. And whether the intelligence is being exhibited by a plant, by a wolf, by a human being, by, any other kind of being, who cares? And so sometimes these definitions and these divisions don't always serve us so well. Just my little rant. Just my rant. Okay. However, following Gerard, a borrowing language from Barad, we must make a cut somewhere in order to retain the ethical imperatives which comes after what acknowledges entanglement. It is entirely possible to hold the radically open ontological insights of multi-species and new materialist thought together with a focus on one particular category of life. By shining a light on vegetal life, the designation of vegetal geography helps to build an remember, not trans, in this case, interdisciplinary community, and identify which might be used as a tool of legitimacy. For early career researchers and undergraduate students in particular, to establish plants as important and viable subjects for research. As argued by Leslie Head, vegetal geography needs to be open and connected to work outside of geography and in the plant sciences and beyond to ensure that our conceptualizations keep up with these intellectual frontiers. To this end, there is much scope in working to establish vegetal geographies more firmly as a lively contributor to critical plant studies. And again, I can see this, right? I can see how this is important to like focus first and then later we'll open. So 3, critical plant studies, a cross-cultural approach. Are you as fascinated by as I am by all this? I just love this. I feel like there's so much here. While antecedents of the field can be traced from the early 2000s, the term critical plant studies emerged in the early 2010s alongside a flourishing of interest in the metaphysical lives of plants and the diverse methodologies required to approach them. Nandini, if you ever watch this, notice how much metaphysical comes into all this conversation. I think it's awesome. Awesome. Importantly, advances in the newly developed field of plant sciences termed plant neurobiology, wow, somebody who has the courage to talk about plant neurobiology, had recently recast the plant as an intelligent organism capable of coordinated response and signaling behaviors. Capacities brought to public attention by Michael Pollan in his 2013 New Yorker article, The Intelligent Plant, which we also reviewed here in Plant Consciousness Commentary. You can go back and you can find it in the list. This growing scientific appreciation of plant liveliness forms a significant body of literature within critical plant studies and has precipitated renewed interest in the ethical and philosophical position of plants. Oh, all these papers are ones that we've read through. And books, these are books. Chamovitz, Galliano, Simard, Chihuahuas, Viola, and Mancuso. Oh, all books that we've read. CPS today, or Critical Plant Studies today, remains an inherently interdisciplinary project encouraging a generative diversity of perspective. Edited volume, The Language of Plants, Science, Philosophy, and Literature is one of the richest collections to date to embrace this approach. Whilst Michael Marder's work, everybody has to talk about Michael Marder, Plant Thinking is often positioned as one of the key texts in this project, others, such as Matthew Hall and Karen Houle, were already beginning to draw attention to the backgrounding of plants in Western thought. Marder traces the position of plants through Western philosophy, arguing that they have been dismissed as the weeds of metaphysics. Right? Planted firmly at the bottom of Aristotle. See, we knew Aristotle had to come up. We should have a bingo card. I think we need to make a bingo card for all of these papers. We need to have a bingo card to see whether or not, so Aristotle, Michael Marder, ontological, epistemological, and all their derivatives, words that are similar, Galliano, Simard, Matthew Hall, Mancuso, Chamovitz. I think we need to create a bingo card. I think it would be super. Linnaeus, definitely another one to add to the bingo card, is something that we definitely have to put in there. Linnaeus is a great one. We should create a bingo card that we read. When we read all these papers, we see, whether or not we can get all of them on the bingo. I might just have to create that. I think it would be really fun. It would be so much fun. Marder traces the position of plants through Western philosophy, arguing that they have been dismissed as the weeds of metaphysics, planted firmly at the bottom of Aristotle's hierarchical chain of being, and denied meaning by Hegel outside of their utility as food or drink for humans. In rehabilitating the plant, Marder theorizes plant being as an inexhaustible generosity towards the other, whilst Marder tries to construct an ethics of plant life by positioning the plants as subaltern and emphasizing the need to respect its absolute otherness. But you used it. Anyway, other theorists have pursued different routes. Nialon, that's one name I don't know, for instance, proposes a biopolitics, which embraces the vegetal, unpicking the position of plant life in the work of Foucault, which is another one we need to add onto the list for our bingo card, Derrida and Deleuze, I think we can put them together as them three. And if you just choose any of those names, you end up getting all of them. And Guattari, in order to support his insistence that plants are the paradigmatic subjects of modern biopower. In an era of climate crisis, the plant provides a simultaneously radical and grounded figure with which to rethink and critique life, with a capital L, beyond the human. Okay. I like. That's interesting. Matt Hall, too, takes the history of Western thought as a starting point in the philosophical explication of plant personhood. I don't like calling him Matt because he goes by Matthew. Anyway. As he points out, instrumental human relationships, human-plant relationships, are ecologically nonsensical. Ingrained in the Western psyche, the houseplant that sits on the windowsill is so far outside of an everyday moral consideration that being a bad plant parent and managing to kill even the most hardy of cacti is considered a joke. Oh my God. So true. So true. So true. So true. So true. I was thinking about this the other day as I was looking around because it's been very hot, and I have certain plants that have decided to end their lives. And it's very frustrating to me and very difficult. And I'm trying to figure out which one of it is, which ones is this a natural progression and which one is it my error as a human being? And this is really taking me into a lot of different looks. Yeah, different loops. I'm in different places, just different places. Okay, sorry, hold on a second. I have to write myself a note about something that I just remembered that I need to do. One sec, please. Okay, sorry. In stark contrast to Martyr, however, Hall goes on to explore plant personhood outside of the Western episteme, in Eastern pagan and indigenous thought. Considering the recognition of, we've done some really awesome papers by both of these. Considering the recognition of plants as kin in such traditions, Hall makes a case for plant ethics based not on otherness, but on close relation and care. It is vital to recognize that much multi-species and plant thinking overlaps with and owes its roots to indigenous cosmologies and perspectives. It is therefore important to retain a productive tension between taking the implications of indigenous knowledge seriously while not simply mining them for our own theoretical purposes. And this is an important one. This is hard. This is a reason why I don't actually get into many discussions of indigenous thought, not because I don't think it's important, but because I don't feel yet qualified enough to speak in a way that is about the true kind of essence of the work and of the thought process, rather than mining it for the processes that I feel like are useful. And I don't think that's right. Okay. Eduardo Cohn's work provides one example of how such a cross-cultural transposition might work in the context of a semiotic world of trees and other beings in Ecuadorian Amazon. Worked by indigenous authors within critical plant studies, like that of plant neurobiologists discussed above, asks what plants might teach us if we listened more closely. Robin Wall-Kimmerer weaves plant science together with Potawatomi teachings, speaking of domesticated crops such as beans, corn, and squash, as eloquent teachers whose wordlessly in leaf and vine embody the knowledge of relationship, creating space for coexistence and mutual flourishing. Mary Sissip Genu's book of Anishinaabe botanical teachings espouses an ethic of asking before taking what the plant has to offer. Talking to plants while feeling silly at first. Silly at first? Whoever feels silly talking to a plant? Not I. Ever. Never. I never feel silly talking to any of you. I just want that on the record. Seems sensible once she considered the plants as persons that they are. Anishinaabe creation teachings, in stark contrast with Aristotle's chain of being, places humans at the bottom of four interconnected orders of life: first earth forces, then plants, non human animals, and finally humans. The most vulnerable of all, humans, forget our dependence on the other orders of life at our peril. Indigenous perspectives on plants are firmly rooted in relation to land and soil, as gardens become active places through which to enact indigenous knowledge, marrying epistemology and ontology, or place thought, both inside and out of the academy. Amongst the displacement of the human in multi-species and plant thought, it is of course imperative that the differences between humans, so often drawn with violence, are not flattened. Critical plant studies must also attend to the colonial histories in which the blurring of lines between the human and the non-human plant or animal was not celebratory, but highly destructive. There is a wealth of feminist, queer, and decolonial scholarship emerging, which offers politically engaged correctives to earlier plant thought, rehabilitating the plant through situated intersexual analysis. Importantly, the history of plant-human interaction is heavily gendered one. While certain authors have attended to these relations, particularly to these relations, the close collaborations between women and plants have long been under-acknowledged. Feminist theory thus has much to offer in attending to specific material plant-human relations which emerge at particular moments in time, unpicking how they might serve or resist the interest of heteropatriarchal capitalism. Much of this work is speculative in nature, concerned with projects of worldling or the imagining of alternative futures in which we ally ourselves more closely with plants. Art and visual culture have a central role to play in these projects in challenging traditions of plant representation and re-envisioning our relationship to the botanical world. Whilst critical plant studies is an emergent field, it is not plowing new ground. It is undeniable that plant lives have not been granted sufficient attention or moral consideration within the Western academy and everyday life. But if the plant is also to be meaningfully reevaluated, authors should locate themselves within those traditions which came before, engaging and citing generously. In taking non-Western ontologies seriously, one might better attend to the diversity in perspectives offered by the plant kingdom, resisting the generalizing inclinations of early plant theory to refocus on spatial and species particularity. Man, there is so, I almost dropped my microphone. There is just so much in there. I find this whole conversation, well, first of all, I think she put way too much into this paper. I mean, there is so much. I mean, we've read some thick, some meaty papers, okay? But this is, whoa. Because it's touching, I guess, because we are talking about the idea of course, an entirely new field that's being born and whether or not it should be born. And I think that makes this whole conversation so much more rich because we have to look at it across a landscape of many different other kinds of disciplines and thought processes. Because again, remember, all of this is paradigm shifting. So in shifting the paradigm, we need to expand our own thought process to see what other paradigms are there out there, and where is it that we have to create versus where is it that we have to integrate, or where is it instead that we have to forget and adopt. I mean, there's just a lot of considerations happening here for all of this to kind of, yeah, for all of this. Let's get into plant otherness. Oh, wait, hold on. There's a question here. I have to wonder if it's the fact that plants were considered women domain that has something to do with plants being largely ignored by science until recently. It's a really great question. I don't know if, I think in the perspective of plants as persons, plants as collaborators, plants as real, what's the word I'm looking for? Mentors. I agree with you. I can totally see that. I think though, it was plants as something to be conquered, plants as something to be discovered, plants as something to be manipulated. that has been the part of science held mainly by men and done by men that has really taken off. I don't know if that makes any sense. But I do think that there is something about this. And also, kind of looking at this from a slightly different perspective, which is something I've thought about a lot, right? The fact that it was so much of plants as something to control, and women traditionally were working in, certain aspects of this, that's why women also were to control. Like, if you remember way back when we did the feminist plant, when we went through that paper, which is an amazing paper, and I highly recommend going through it and going and looking at the recording of my commentary on the feminist plant, there is something there about the control exerted over plants as the control exerted over women. So yeah. Yes. And I get what you're saying, Michelle, in the sense that this conversation has been going on in so many different ways. But I think the plants were really not the last, but they were a frontier of domination and control. And especially from the perspective of, without plants, we all die. Like, we cannot do anything without plants. And so therefore, of course, it must be ours to control, to have dominion over. But wow, that's a whole other conversation, which I agree is to have, definitely one to have. Let's go into plant otherness, but that is a great conversation to have. Okay. One of the most fundamental debates within plant studies is how to deal with the perceived ontological otherness of plants to human animal subjects, in theory and in practice. Unquestionably, plants are radically other than animals. Theorists within CPS, I have to say, because if I see CPS, I think Child Protective Services. So I have to say critical plant studies are concerned with what this otherness means for how we think with and about plants as subjects, as well as a transformative potential for our ethical imaginations more broadly. Following Plumwood, if the interwoven dualisms of Western thought, which disallow a non-hierarchical concept of otherness, are to be escaped, there must be room for recognizing both continuity and difference. This first section focuses on the different conceptualizations of plant otherness sameness, which have emerged within CPS. First, in philosophical terms, then more practically within scientific and linguistic debates and plant-human research. Thinking with plant otherness has self-consciously been an intellectual exercise for some authors, including Karen Houle, who argues for the radical reimagining of life, capital O, and its relations provoked by philosophizing with plant bodies. Houle, following Sylvia Poutot, sees the fundamental ontological difference between plants and animals in the fact that animal bodies are bifurcated by the mechanism of gastrulation, an early embryonic transformation which give rise to a dualistic state of being, divided between the inner, mouth, digestive tract, anus, and the outer. Plant bodies, on the other hand, are not bifurcated in this way. They do not have this dualistic or Cartesian inclined state of being, facing only outwards and thus demanding their own phytospecific ontology, which resists the inherently oppositional dualism of animalesque thought. Well, that's a concept I hadn't caught about. I am going to have to ruminate on that one. That's really fascinating. All right. Let me write down Houle, more study to do on Houle. Martyr similarly considers this outward-facing nature of plants in his plant thinking, arguing that the ontological otherness of the plant is absolute. As humans, he argues, we can never fully know the plant. Plants lack the psychic and subjective interiority of animals. I hate that this came from Martyr. I hate it. Plants lack the psychic and subjective interiority of animal. How do you know that? How do you know that? I don't believe that's true. and constitute rather than set themselves apart from the environment that sustains them. I hate when people try to read the mind of plants in that way and assume that there is no interiority. I disagree with that. I disagree. I disagree. Plants thus have their own distinct subjectivity, which, according to Martyr, does not overlap with the human. We don't know. In order to hear plants speak, then, one must learn to listen to the silences, leaving room for the untranslatable so as not to impose human voices and discursive categories onto the vegetal world. I'm okay with this. But the peculiar ontology of plant comes to represent the embodied limits to empathy. Empathy, Martyr argues, presumes a fundamental commonality between parties, which is precluded by the impossibility of human self-recognition in the vegetal world outside of an injurious and narcissistic anthropomorphism. Yeah, I like that. I like that, Jill. Interspecies realities in divine plan must be conceptualized. Exactly. We're trying to use models and that doesn't work. To take an example, Franklin Ginn draws upon this extreme otherness of the plant in theorizing the inherent uncertainty and unpredictability which characterizes the practice of domestic gardening. Considering plants as archives of their external conditions, Ginn suggests that gardeners can assist in the flourishing of plants, but can never control them, since there is no self or subject to bring under control. I don't know. What do you think about that? There seems to be a flaw in this logic. Ginn suggests that gardeners can assist in the flourishing of plants, but they can never control them. I don't know about that. Actually, it's an interesting thought process because if you think about how much control we do exercise over plants, the fact that we can control them is he's obviously not meant moonflower. I love that, Michelle. It's true. That's my point. I think actually you could look at it as the opposite, which is the fact that I think this is limited. I mean, I see what they're saying, but it feels very limited. No self or subject to bring under control. I disagree. And I think the fact that we try to control them so much is because there is a self that's there. Even the temporality of the garden plant is not their own, but is that of their other. Be that the diurnal cycles of light and dark or the calendars of insect pollinators. For Ginn, the recognition of this plant strangeness facilitates a full appreciation of the depth of partnership between gardener and plant. This strangeness, however, is at risk of being fetishized. I agree, Michelle. They've helped us, they've convinced us to help us propagate them. This is what's really going on, man. And Michael Pollan's whole theory, which I think is really fun. This strangeness, however, is at risk of being fetishized. As put by Cohn, if we take otherness to be the privileged vantage from which we defamiliarize our nature, we risk making our forays into the non-human a search for ever stranger positions from which to carry out this project. What then are the limits to Martyr's claim as to the radical otherness of plant life? Plants, like animals, exhibit coordinated responses which are more than simple local chemical reactions and which involve some of the same neurotransmitters. Some of the same neurotransmitters as humans. I think she forgot to finish that phrase because, anyway, putting humans in the center means I don't have to finish it, but I have to finish it. Plants can respond to the sound recording of a caterpillar munching on a leaf and produce defense chemicals before any of their leaves have been touched. Galliano et al. Showed that mimosa plants can remember a stimuli such as a drop or a shake and demonstrated the learned response a month after initial testing. For plant neurobiologists, such evidence points to the existence of a certain type of sentience proper to plant life. Terms such as sentience and intelligence, typically reserved for humans and other high-order animals, have been extended to the plant kingdom in order to recognize and valorize the remarkable capacities of plants, although not uncontroversially. Such language draws animals and plants into closer relation than Martyr's extreme otherness would allow. Yeah, Martyr, you have to go through that paper. We've gone through the paper where Martyr sort of explains this thinking. It's very subtle. It's very sophisticated, as only Martyr could do. But it's worth experiencing because he has this conflict with otherness in this way. He really does have this conflict in wanting to respect the plant for the plant's sake as whatever plant is. And of course, the human vocabulary that we have that says I can only understand something by comparing it to what I am. This is not to denigrate the plant by placing it in some hierarchy of intelligence. Don't call the plant an it. Key in some hierarchy of intelligence, but rather to just transform our definitions and understandings of these concepts. Galeano's Mimoso experiments make it clear that brains and neurons are not a necessary requirement for learning, communication, and coordinated response. Instead, plants invite us to pursue distributed definitions of sentience and intelligence, defined as the ability to respond optimally to one's environment and, perhaps controversially, consciousness. In her philosophical assessment of plant intelligence, Baker argues that it is unnatural to draw a conceptual boundary line, for instance, between animals and plants, where there is no justification for it, and where similarities would constantly draw us across due to its arbitrary nature. It is entirely possible, therefore, to correctly extend concepts such as intelligence through a family resemblance without implying a comparative lack. Context allows for the acknowledgement of different instantations of intelligence or sentience. Plant intelligence is not lacking, but is proper to the world of the plant. It's a great way of putting it. By redefining certain terms, such as consciousness, from the plant's perspective, theorists can be freed from Hegelian concerns over the inaccessibility of the consciousness of the other and definitions of consciousness as something that is like, and instead attend to the world through observation, conceptualizing the consciousness of living beings as how they are in the world unfurls a multitude of learning and possibilities. Each creature carries with it mode of being and openness peculiar to their species. To this end, redefining consciousness, sentience, and intelligence from the plant up as an appropriate responsiveness to the lived environment frees animals and humans alike from anthropocentric, phagocentric, and ableist determinations of these terms. In vegetalizing human concepts, we are invited to step out of the hierarchical chain of beings and renaturalize ourselves amidst the conflicts and connections of our world. Here one often faces the charge of anthropomorphism. Martyr, for instance, takes issue with the projection of the human onto the plant as a narcissistic practice of self-reverence, which does a disservice to the plant being observed. The major function of such a charge, however, is arguably to bully people out of thinking differently. Twisting the concept of anthropomorphism can be a useful weapon against an anthropocentrism in which the human gets to hold all the goodies, such as agency, intentionality, and language. Yeah, but such a hard concept because we don't want to compare, but all we know how to do is compare, because how can we imagine something if we don't compare? DeWall speaks, for instance, of an animal-centric anthropomorphism, which encourages an understanding of the animal perspective with reference to human experience. But what of phytocentric anthropomorphism? We read a paper, I can't remember which one it was, that talked about this, phytocentric anthropomorphism. It is difficult to recognize human resemblance in plants, but instead of recognizing us in them, we might recognize them in us. This is why I am always talking about reawakening your plantness. The concept of phytomorphism, taken up by anthropologists Natasha, actually, she's the planthropologist, Natasha Myers, in relation to the material intimacies of plant scientists with their vegetal research subjects, makes explicit the multidirectional potential of anthropomorphism, indicative of our capacity and willingness to open ourselves up to others. Phytomorphism invites us to vegetalize our already more than human bodies and attach ourselves to things which plants care about, and which, in the end, humans must care about too if we are to build a more sustainable relation to our planet. Suzanne Simard, for instance, speaks of mother trees and their children purposefully to replace us within nature and overcome the claims to human exceptionalism perpetuated by critics of an anthropomorphism. Asking questions like, what do plants know, draws attentions to plants as living beings with their own ways of knowing the world. I stress again that this is not a new attunement, but one which many communities across the world have been learning from for centuries. In this regard, Matthew Hall, attribution of personhood to plants is not a reductive assimilation of plant to human, something that Martyr sometimes argues, but is consistent with many non-Western and pagan ontologies. In contrast to Martyr, Hall pays close attention to the history of plant life and the particularities of diverse plant-human relations. Plants are first regarded as kin based on the recognition of consubstantiality, quite literally given our common single-celled ancestors some 1.6 billion years ago, which is very similar to what Antonio Irre talked about in episode 68 of the podcast, where he went into this conversation. And that's how he creates a lot of his art, is starting from this process of the idea that we have a single-celled ancestor, we split off, and therefore we have a commonality that we can share cellularly. With the structuring of relationships taking place within a heterarchy, not a hierarchy. Such a recognition consistent with indigenous ethics of connection throws open a world of situated responsibility within which a more grounded, more than human ethics of mutual care might flourish. Arnold et al., for instance, reify and the attribution of personhood to trees within an Aboriginal Australian Yuin ontology, arguing that the anthropomorphism inherent in conversing or yarning with trees opens a space for communication and establishes an intuitive basis for empathy with non-humans based on the tree as a relative or extension of the body. The emplacement of human, plant, animal, and land identities within one another radically reconceptualizes the separation of the individual in ways which resonate with the plant's own troubling of this category. Man, so much to think about. So much. I have a feeling I'm going to be dreaming about these conversations for the next month. There's just so much here. Often, when these debates surrounding plant otherness are grounded in real-life observations of plant-human relations, a common line of argument emerges that plant bodies are both the same as and different from human and animal bodies. For Atchison and Head, the plant perspective opens up new ways of thinking about life as a process in which common capacities manifest themselves in different material forms. Understanding the specific differences of plant bodies does not, therefore, preclude a form of human-plant relation based on policies of recognition or shared intuition, but instead invites us to trouble this binary of same different. For instance, such and such, whatever, you understood it. The word, the name, I do not want to disrespect your name by butchering it. For instance, explores the difficulties presented by plant alterity in farm work, which result in plant-human relations often being considered in terms of control rather than care. I know, it is. I agree with this one. She describes the relations of farm workers with vines as based both on the recognition of never fully knowing the plants, as well as the intuitive actions that emerge from the close relationships formed between workers and plant. Sorry, I had to stop for this one because this one's great. I think it's funny that we're so concerned about categorizing and defining. I'm pretty sure that plants find us amusing. I think you're absolutely right. I think they do find us amusing. I think that they must be like having a good old laugh at, Kin must have really just sit there and go, why do they think so? As a matter of fact, I did one of the classes I taught, this one was in Norway. I was teaching communication with the plant world in Norway, and a woman sat down with an apple tree to have a conversation about this type, not this particular subject. It was more about arguing and working together. And the plant was like, what are you talking about? Like, we just don't have those same types of problems. This is how we deal with this, which is probably the closest thing I can figure out. But this thing you're talking about, yeah, we don't do that. We don't have that. Nope. Nope. And no. So I think it's really funny. Um, Echoing. Intuition is an interesting term to unpick, arguably denoting the preconscious recognition of a shared aliveness between human and plant. What might the charismatic growth of spring vines compared with static winter vines tell us about the flux of plant otherness, resemblance through place and time? The tracing of similarities between people and plants has a practical purpose in everyday life as a basis for recognizing how we are already affected by plants and as a means of developing relations of empathy which might benefit plants in human projects as such as wildlife conservation. Once this basis has been established, we might learn to attune ourselves more closely to plant differences, opening up our sensoriums to develop new capacities to act with and among plants. Learning to be affected by plants is not a linear process. At different times and in different spaces, it involves differential recognition of plant otherness, or similarly as a situation invites. Interrogating the challenges involved in knowing plants does not lessen the imperative to make the attempt. The concept of plant personhood, mistakenly rejected by Martyr as naive and problematic, simply seeks to emphasize connection and recognition of shared characteristics. Like I said, we've gone through Martyr's paper on this, and he struggles. He really does struggle because he does not want to limit to him, conveying plant personhood, that word personhood, limits the expansive nature of plants. Because he says we are almost dumbing down a plant to what I think of as a person from a human animal perspective. And that is a limitation on the true perspective of what it means to be a person as an animal, as a plant. And I think that that's a fascinating argument. As put by Hall, in a world in which human societies have constructed and emphasized difference in order to justify domination, the ethic of connection is a powerful countervailing force. Thinking with plants pushes us away from taking the individual as the locus of ethics and the experience of living as multiple, contingent, and changing. And see, the fact that ancestor is a plant that, that has, it's look, man, ancestor schools you, Michelle. So let's just be honest. Ancestor is, yeah. So my point that I was about to say and lost my train of thought because I was just cracking up at the thought of ancestor is that this goes back to what I said from the beginning. A lot of these discussions are still along the veins of plant persons, which is great, but it's not the same as me working with a plant. She did not sit down with a plant and have this conversation. She did not go through this paper in detail with a plant to then decide what it was that she was going to talk about and work through and stuff like that. No, she did all of her research and wrote this paper, but that's not the same thing as bringing the plant into the conversation, which is, I think, where we need to go. All right, let's talk about section 5 because we still have section 5. We still have section 6. Hold on a second because now I'm curious as to where we are. We are, oh my goodness, page 9 of 23. When does this paper end? Oof, this is a long one. Oh, there's the conclusion and the references start on page 15. Okay, we've got 4 pages to go because we're on 9. Oh, we were on 9. Where's 9? Yes, we are on 9. Menu. View. Read mode because it makes it better to see it. Okay. Plant ethics. How then might we conceptualize the ethical standing of plants? As remarked by Sandilands, there are many philosophical and practical quagmires surrounding plant agency, in particular their ability to experience stress. A foundational critique in critical plant study starts from the position that the zoocentrism promoted by animal theorists as supposed antidote to anthropomorphism has at times placed value on certain kinds of sentient creatures based on human resemblance. The types of pain or cognitive experiences of suffering that we can recognize in ourselves, instead of displacing the human, we end up reifying our status as an ethical and ontological yardstick amongst bios. Bruh. Yeah. As explored in the previous section, extending concepts such as sentience to plants invites a rethinking of our ethical and moral obligations to plant life, which can be terrifying. This ethical rethinking collides with difficult questions of diet, climate change, race, and capital, amongst others. How can we best value plants with their entangled relations with other beings? Yeah, how can we best value plants when value is based on ownership? Are plants slaves? These are some of the questions. What a plant ethics should look like is up for debate. Proponents have advanced utilitarian, relational, and neo-Aristotelian arguments, as well as those based on inherent worth. The recognition of sentience in living beings, defined as having of interests such as avoidance of pain and experience of happiness, has typically been important in asserting a claim to ethical considerations. As plant neurobiologists have shown, plants very much have interests. They recognize and respond to dangers and stress. And whilst they do not cognitively experience happiness, we don't know that. They have determined conditions for flourishing. Indeed, Balushka points to plant synthesis as a stress response hormone, ethylene, which acts as a powerful anesthetic in animals, as evidence of some form of negative experience in plants. Of course, it must be acknowledged that experience cannot be taken in the cognitive sense that it is often understood due to the plant's lack of a central nervous system. But it should rather be read as an invocation to torque our understanding of consciousness or experience, hence the whole soul blindness, in order to rough out an ethics from the plant's point of view. This suggestion is, of course, not uncontroversial, as Martyr and Francione debate around what this might mean for vegan ethics exemplifies. Yes. When considering the possibility of plant sentience and ethics, many plant theorists are drawn towards the logical quandary of how to make ethical food choices in light of the fact that almost all possible foods are drawn from sentient beings. How long have I been saying this? Do you know how many arguments I have had with vegans who try to tell me you can't eat animals because you have to eat plants because animals are sentient and so are plants. So then talk to me. Explain this to me because I'm all ears. The screaming lettuce has long been a subject of humor and ridicule, but what sort of ethical transformations might be prompted if it were taken seriously? Really, these are some of those considerations. Martyr, for instance, advocates for an eating like a plant, calling for greater local consumption and a refusal to regulate the human relation to plants on the basis of commodity economic logic. How should a vegan ethics respond to the acknowledgement that all consumption involves some form of violence and death? How should it? This acknowledgement does not seek to denigrate the suffering of animals by means of comparison. Clearly, a vegan diet also paradoxically ensures that fewer plants are consumed overall. This is why I always say it's about relationships. You should eat based on relationships. One engagement by Gard, following Plumwood, outlines an ecofeminist approach to this problem based in a contextual moral veganism, which is rooted in grounded ecological relations rather than universal rules or ultimate moral designations. While individual dietary choices is all very well, it is also essential to step into the ethical quagmire of instrumentalization, aka agriculture, which underpins our system of industrial agriculture. Fake meat is a particularly fertile site for thinking through the ethics of plant-based consumption, an industry projected to be worth 85 billion in the next decade. Because no, let's just eat plants instead of animals, because that is more ethically suited. We have to rethink consumption all over the place, starting with food. Wiley's queer analysis of the fake meat industry reads pleasure and harm together, providing an excellent example of how complex multi-species ethics can be read alongside sustained attention to human categories such as class and sexuality. Crucially, as Wiley puts it, it goes without saying that plant foods are also the fruits and vegetables, as it were, of relations of violence and exploitation that affect our human and non-human kin. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. When talking about violence against sentient beings, agriculture, come on. Come on. It's got to be top on the list. It's got to be top on the list. A key, just go to any supermarket, like on the day before the garbage is supposed to come. And a key concern within multi-species work in general is ensuring that the human does not become an undifferentiated mass within analysis. Specificity of language is important in order to retain an ethical position. Certain terms such as native, cultivation, and colony, for instance, have multi-referential capacities within the English language, which allows them to travel freely between plant, bacteria, and human. Hartigan similarly explores the concept and language of race, which historically crosses over into the plant kingdom as a biological category below subspecies and above strain, drawing attention to those power-laden dealings with plants which come to venerate certain species relations at the cost of others. These types of linguistic slippages can be useful in drawing attention to how the boundaries between nature and culture are actively configured and reconfigured. Scholars writing about native plants, for instance, have considered the planting and displanting of both human and plants within settler colonial projects in order to trouble critiques which hold the species nativism represents a thinly veiled anti-immigrant xenophobia. Haraway and Singh's plantationicine concept similarly endeavors to foreground the violent entanglements of human and plant bodies and their centrality to historical and contemporary projects of racial capitalism. Haraway et al. Have, however, been criticized for the multi-species flattening inherent in the blunt edge of comparison drawn between plant and human in referring to plantations as the slavery of plants. Did I not just say, didn't I say slavery of plants like about half an hour ago? I said it. I said it. And I still think it's true. As argued by Davis et al., an engagement with existing work within Black and Indigenous geographies and ecologies would help to attend more carefully to the spaces of plantation and the specific relations and ruptures forged therein. For instance, uses a framing of Black fungibility in her approach to the plantation, narrating the historical imagination of Black bodies in 17th century Barbados as plants and vegetation as one specific instantiation, of the making fungible of Black bodies through their porous connections with plants. In tracing the entanglements of human and non-human terminology, for instance, between the worlds of eugenics and plant breeding, a critical eye must be kept on the uneven dynamics of power which permeate these histories when naming and writing the non-human. This is fascinating. I hope I find more papers like this to talk about this, because I don't know about you, and if you like this argument, please put up comment, let me know, because I'm going to look for more papers of this, because I find this entire conversation fascinating. Remember we had talked about queer ecology, and I was talking about and feminist ecology, and I was talking about how much more expansive it is to look at these situations when looked through the eyes of a plant, when looking and working with plants to help understand the true depth of the situation by approaching it from a different perspective. And I think that this is a great perspective relating to slavery, relating to racial boundaries, relating to racism because of that. Geographers have also been active in developing a language to conceptualize the work that plants do within capitalist economies and how it is valued. The step towards developing a more ethical relations with plants is not just on the individual or local scale, but on a more industrial and systemic level, because recognizing plants as conscious is going to change everything. Drawing, for instance, on Perkins' extractorization of non-social labor within his Marxian actor network mapping of a Dutch elm disease. Seriously, if you just tap into this recording right now, give yourself a few minutes to acclimatize to what we're talking about, because I can imagine that if you just approach this right now and you just come into this live stream, you're like, what the hell is she talking about? Just, zoom on back a little bit, go back a little bit, ramp up in order to get to where we are, because these are pretty deep topics that require a little bit of background. If you're a vegetal geographer, then this stuff is easy for you. But if you're not, give yourself a little ramp. It's kind of like you got to come in and you just need a little extra time. Drawing, for instance, on Perkins' characterization of non-social labor within his Marxian actor network mapping of Dutch elm disease and Battistoni notion of hybrid labor, a plant growth has been framed in terms of non-human labor, which at one point we considered, unfortunately, people of color non-human labor in some ways. So do you see the parallels here? This is the parallels. For Perkins and Palmer, who considers the work of forest as carbon sinks, have we asked the plants if that's what they want to be doing? I mean, they're going to do, kin are going to do it in general, but I mean, when we specifically plant that only for that purpose. Anyway, this language draws attention to the political power of non-human life, critiquing the valuation of plant life as natural capital or ecosystem services. Even I'm starting to have problems with the term ecosystem services. I'm going to need to rethink so many things. Rather than reducing plants to the status of docile worker, the concept of labor is redefined as the metabolic capacity to change the form of matter, an open-ended process not necessarily prescribed by capitalistic logics of productivity or efficiency. Conceptualizing plants as workers can also draw attention to their active role in shaping the work demanded from the human who labor alongside them. This framing of plants rubs somewhat uneasily up against the tendency towards enchantment which characterizes much plant thinking, providing a provocative challenge to more emotional-centered reading of plant-human relations. One of the greatest promises of plant labor, as the proposition lies in its binding together of material plant bodies, their effects, and the larger scale processes, industrial and non, which they are tied to. As such, a plant's ethics cannot by its very nature be limited to the plants themselves, but is inherently multi-species, multi-scalar, multi-elemental, as already conceptualized in certain non-Western metaphysical traditions, such as the Dakota ethics reference of by Talbert. And remember, at the very beginning of this, I talked about the fact that plant ethics, I think, is going to be where all of these other topics, plant languages and plant cognition and all these other aspects have been addressed in many different places. The concept of the plant ethics piece around here is really at its infancy, especially when this paper was written in 2021. This plant ethics conundrum, which again will, in my opinion, be pioneered by many of the legal scholars in these areas, but should be expanded to a full transdisciplinary conversation that touches the philosophical elements that we've seen here with Martyr and even some of the ones from Hall, and also goes deeper into many of the other considerations around queer ecology and ecofeminism and racial implications and colonial. There's just so many aspects that this is all going to touch. And yet, if we left, everyone else would sort themselves out and be just fine. This is a true statement too, that if we just got the hell out of the way as humans, but that's not going to happen, man. So we have to deal with it. It's not going to happen. Such a multi-elemental ethics, for want of a better phrase, draws attention to the soil, to water, fire, and to what Kokshia refers to as the ontology of the atmosphere, the plant's production of the world through its invisible atmospheric labor, in which every living being is, first of all, what makes possible the life of others. Is first of all, yes. And this goes to the idea of what Michelle was saying earlier, that if we would just get the hell out of the way, everything would just sort itself out, because we are not the ones that are making life possible for everyone else. On the contrary, we're probably doing more harm than good sometimes. Air is the fundamental commons which intimately ties us to plants, central to our ethical considerations of animals and plants alike through the universal exchange of breath. As Pratt argues, air quality is highly significant human health risk implicated in all major health issues. It is also, of course, a highly unequal resource, with disparities in urban green cover and botanies of negligence becoming crucial sites of social environmental inequality, disproportionately affecting both the air and soil quality and consequently the health of poor neighborhoods and communities of color. In other words, do not buy avocados unless you're growing them yourselves, because you're getting rid of water for people who really need it. You're destroying the soil, and then that affects the air quality. There's just so much. All the entanglement. The social contract of atmospheric production binding plants and humans is central to achieving multi-species justice for both groups, and made concrete in artist Natalie Jeremijenko's experimental positioning of trees as landlords designed to reconceptualize the value system defining our current relations. Urban and rural spaces demand different plant ethics attuned to their specific multi-species contexts, yet there will always be a tension of scale dictated by the very nature of the plant and simultaneously rooted in context, specific place, and outwardly productive of its broader environment. If plants are considered solely in terms of the atmosphere and ecologies they co-constitute, they risk being backgrounded once more as environment rather than subjects in their own right. This tension might thus be productive of a peculiarly planty ethics of scale if we allow our attention to be guided by vegetal bodies, considering their interest alongside our own. I told you that the whole ethics conversation would be the big heart of this. All right. Plant-human attunement. Hold on one second. I want to see something. How can that be? Oh, okay. Wait, what just happened? Hold on. Oh. Okay. All right, I'm like trying to understand where we are. All right, plant-human attunements. Again, if you're just joining us, besides the fact of doing all the YouTube-y stuff, hit your like, hit your subscribe, ring the bell, all that kind of fun stuff. Also, share. And if you don't understand where we are, just go back in time a little bit. We've got about 2 hours that we've been here already, and there's lots that we've gone through. There's lots. So it's totally worth it for you to go back a little bit and check it out. All right, plant-human attunements. Returning to the epigraph of this paper, how might we hear plants sing? Methodological, well, I know how, but it's called the music of the plants, and I don't think that's what they're talking about. Methodological innovation is perhaps the area for which geographers are best recognized within interdisciplinary plant scholarship, in particular the interventions of Hitchens, Heed, Atchison, and Pitt. Methodological and theoretical approaches which have been advanced include walking, photography, and visual ethnography. Participatory mapping, the concept of showing and being shown, influenced by Tim Ingold, and the research strategy of following the plant. Vegetal geographers have also played with written form, experimenting with short storytelling, photo essays, and reflective autoethnography of research embodiment. Recent calls for greater experimentation within vegetal geography are allied with agenda within critical plant studies, particularly those emerging from anthropology, which typically approach methodological experimentation as transformative of both research and real-world plant-human relations and ethics. Within critical plant studies, the lively interplay between science, philosophy, and art has produced a veritable orchard with ripe fruit for picking by social scientists looking for inspiration. In particular, the idea of play is considered an important orientation towards plant life. Play liberates being from the realm of necessity and values of efficiency, of productivity, and is therefore a useful means of refocusing the lens away from teleological accounts of plants as commodities or raw materials. Considering plants outside the logic of utility, even when researching food chains or commercial forestry, leads us to attend to plant bodies in a less instrumental manner and considers our relations within a broader context of shared life and inherent worth. We need, as put by Gibson and Warren, we need diverse experiments in both epistemology and ontology in order to conjure new worlds into being. It's true. We need lots of it. Experiments in speculative play with vegetal life invites different modes of attention, a concept much explored by bioartists seeking to draw audiences' attention to the liveliness of plants. Plants challenge us to connect with our somatic and sensory experiences in order to consider the more embodied meaning of sentience as being alive to one's environment. This is the reason why in the Reconnect with Plant Wisdom, the Reconnect with Plant Wisdom podcast, I have been interviewing so many of these particular artists because I think it's fascinating and super important to give a voice to the work that they're doing and to show how their somatic, theatrical, performance-based art, in addition to other forms of art, is really a collaboration with plants that bring the vegetal mind into the foreground and it gives that vegetal mind an opportunity to express himself. I find that if you haven't gone check it out, go check it out. Go to my website, tigriagardenia.com/podcast, and you will find all the episodes there. And yes, it's amazing. Just so interesting to see how these artists, these human artists, are working with these different plant artists. Natasha Myers, one of my favorites. I have an academic crush on her. Pursues this invocation by experimenting with slow shutter speed photography to document the gestures of living plants. I've also published some of this work of hers. It's her and another person, and they're doing, it's a beautiful project. To document the gestures of living plants, drawing energy diagrams as a means of recording sense. Myers also uses the kinesthetic attunement of dance, because she's a dancer. She's a planthropologist and a dancer, conceived as a universal movement common to both human and non-human nature. To attend to the rhythms, temporalities, and movements of plants explicitly as a means of pushing against the claims of scientific rationalism, which disavows non-human sentience. The embodiment of Stevie Wonder's Black Orchid by dancer Eartha Robinson in the 1978 documentary The Secret Life of Plants similarly draws visceral lines of phytomorphic connection between plant and person, performing the dissonances of race and urban nature and pointing to the potential of film as a medium for exploring plant-human relations and plant perspectives as explored by Amy Cutler. See also Gandhi and Jasper's film Natura. Such literal embodiment of plant performance recognizes the creative agency of plants, problematizing their fetishization as aesthetic objects. And there's a lot of this. We've gone through various papers about vegetal performance as well as artists of all different types. I highly recommend. Between the podcast and this commentary, there's so much material there if you're interested in learning more. Artists who create pieces of living art involving live plants similarly play with the gaps between the meanings imposed by humans and the meanings generated by the growth of the plants themselves. Weeds are especially interesting plants to follow in this context. Let's just call them wild plants. I'm just going to call them wild plants. Lacking determinate biological meaning, the absence of utility inherent in the unruly definition of how can you say absence of utility when it comes to wild plants? See why I don't want to call them weeds? not calling them weeds, with an innate disposition to get into the wrong place or to be close to humans to give their medicine and to share their properties. I do not like this part. Provides to an interesting imaginative space in which to explore the values we place on plant life. The wild plant reveals the limits to more than human ethics of care, estranged from the utilitarian valuation of productive life. Artist Ellie Irons cultivates wild plants in her sanctuary for wild planty species. I'm not going to say that other word. Conceptualizing them as perfect companion species for the Anthropocene age, resonating with Anna Singh's concept of slow disturbance landscapes, which draws us into collaborative cosmopolitan kinships with those species through which diversity may continue to emerge in the ruins. In facilitating play in these landscapes, art plays a central role in the ontological reappraisal of valuable life, particularly within urban context, as well as considering the multiplicity of plant-human relations grown in the contemporary world. It is also vital to stimulate them historically in order to acknowledge and critique the structures of power that determine which modes of relation tend to dominate. Yeah, the loudest. That's the one that tends to dominate, the loudest. Trees and forests in particular have been given considerable attention within historical geography. So true. And people forget that there are other types of plants and that even forests have many different types of plants, not just trees. And as in efforts to trace the colonial and state presences with which haunt contemporary arboreal biopolitics and understanding of forest spaces, the role of trees in protest and resistance, the securitization of nation states, the social political lives of trees are more conspicuous than those of other plants, due in part to their slower and more legible timescales, as well as their firm rootedness in space, which allows individual trees to be imbued with intergenerational meaning and emotion. I don't know about all of you, but I am not liking that. I mean, I have you touched on another nerve for me, because this whole concept of the way that we view trees, to my opinion, is so freaking limiting, so limiting, so limiting, so limiting. And we forget all these other plants that are so important and have done so much because we cannot see the plants for the trees. Not the forest for the trees, the plants for the trees. By contrast, other vegetal forms, such as the flower, you do know that there are flowering plants, flowering trees, right? And that a flower is not okay, are defined by more material instability, granting them the ability to represent an image of impermanent vegetal mass beyond individual plant bodies. Really, you've never seen okay, I'm just going to hold my thoughts right now. Demanding alternative modes of approach. One of the key contributions of critical plant studies then is to shift attention away from now I'm curious as to what she's going to say, rootedness of plants and the fixity of the individual, troubling our conceptions of scale and what actually constitutes individual beings, vegetal and otherwise. Plant bodies are not contained within a finite skin, but can spread rhizomatically until we are not quite sure whether we can count 10 primroses beneath the oak or only one, 50 aspens or one suckering clonal colony. Their permeable boundaries challenge assemblage thinking and fundamentally disrupt the lines drawn between subject and environment. In pursuing these provocations, historical geographers can borrow approaches from the flourishing body of work emerging from the intersections of literary eco-criticism and critical plant studies. Literary studies is one of the fastest growing areas within critical plant studies. Oh yeah, we did some amazing stuff on vegetality and poetry, which scholars concerned with rehabilitating literary plants from their typical background and designation as environment and considering the ways in which phytopoetics, which we just did a paper on. We just did a paper on phytopoetics, might help us to understand abstract notions like space and time in different ways. Following the approaches of literary scholars of the transcorporeality of human and plant bodies, how bodily boundaries are co-constructed and crossed can help researchers playing with plant shadows in archives. Accessing plant voices in archives can be challenging since they have almost always been translated by at least one human voice or hand. Yeah, that's why we need more scholarship around plant communication, because once it becomes more acceptable, we will have many more people that allow themselves to step out of the humanness in order to be on the plant. And we do more co-authorship, like what Sydney Kale is doing. Another podcast episode. Patricia Vieira, for instance, proposes phytographia as a mode of reading vegetal inscriptions in both materialities and literary content of writing. Again, this is an experimental orientation, inviting us to listen to the vegetal kingdom in different ways. In experimenting with plants in theory and practice, the question of ethics reemerges. To what extent might plants be considered research participants, if you ask them? And how might this transform our approaches to them? For instance, experiments with poisoning plants as experts and considers plenty research as an apprenticeship. Look, man, if we're going to open the research thing also, that's another subject area. We talk about animal research, but we never talk about plants and how we kill plants every day just because. Whilst retaining a healthy skepticism as to the practical challenges of involving plants in the decision-making process, Pitt argues that it is the question asked in this process which are most valuable. Importantly, the question of who is this research for? In considering plants more seriously as participants, we are pushed to consider what research aims looks like from the plant's perspective. These are already good questions to be asking. I'm happy with these questions. This leads us to pursue lines of conversation which flow not only across species and disciplinary boundaries, but also between academic and non-academic world. Much geographical work on plant biosecurity in particular pursues these experimental provocations. So that's what plant biosecurity is. Asking how we might better live with invasive species. Or plant disease in practice, constructing a new politics for biosecurity, which can more deftly respond to life's capacity for emergence. As put by Myers, if we thought like a plant, we would pay more attention to what we put in our water, air, and soil. I am agreeing with this. It is the question we ask ourselves as researchers when planting. This is why reawakening your plantness is so important. This is the work I love to do with people. I love working with humans and plants together to reawaken human plantness so that you can start to look at the world around you, all of your world, your family, your business, everything that you do with plant eyes, because I guarantee it would be different than the way you're doing it now. Guarantee. It is the question we ask ourselves as researchers when plenty participants are taken seriously that push research further towards eventual aims of expressing alternative futures of living well with plants. Interesting. All right, conclusion. We made it to the conclusion. The work in critical plant studies introduced in this paper has turned the theoretical soil of more than human scholarship, drawing attention to the specificities of working with plants, from how to deal with their ontological otherness to the troubling of ethical frameworks and demanding of new methodological attunements. Much of this work maintains a high level of fluidity across disciplinary lines, allowing for a truly holistic approach to plant life. Geographers have contributed to the unfurling of critical plant studies as the project from the start, calling for greater attention to vegetal politics in tackling head-on the persistent backgrounding of plants within our discipline, as well as proposing innovative methodologies through which to practically approach plant difference. Within geography, however, the bias towards animal life remains significant. Honey, in everything. Like in everything, it's significant. Meaningfully involving plants within our reconsideration of the more than human pushes us beyond a zoocentric ethics, and it pushes our capacity to interact with beings who do not look and act like us, of care based on recognizable animal sentience, instead forcing us to confront the uncomfortable reality of an entangled vegetal ethics. Told you, it's all going to come down to the ethics. of life, built partially around necessary violence and harm. Necessary? Some, maybe. Food, maybe. But does it have to be violent? Harm? Okay. Again, another conversation to have. I have this conversation, by the way, in Reconnect with the Plant Kingdom, in my course in Reconnect with the Plant Kingdom, which if you're in Blooming Sprouts or Flourishing Sprouts, you have access to it. In Reconnect with the Plant Kingdom, there's an entire module all dedicated to food to touch all these conversations. Here, food geographies in particular stand to gain from confronting the future of plant-based proteins in order to center plants and their inorganic associates, both in terms of ethics and in questioning the ecological implications of such dietary shifts. The urgency of the current ecological crisis similarly compares a need to populate the ground with stories of plant experimentation in the face of climate change, which geographers are well placed to provide. In particular, the important role of urban forests in climate change mitigation demand critical insights into plant-human relations to supplement more quantitative studies of tree planting and policy. I don't like this sentence because it goes back to, it just relies back on the way that we think of plants as commodities. Despite the relative lack of disciplinary identity, I think you could rewrite that as a more partnership-based. Despite the relative lack of disciplinary identity, the field or amorphous shrubland of vegetal geography is currently flourishing. This paper has drawn attention to the work going on within this area and in the hope that geographers interested in the more than human might begin to think more carefully about the plants that feature in their work, be they living or dead, transformed into food or commodity. It also sought to identify certain areas of cross-disciplinary conversation in order to more formally introduce scholars within critical plant studies to these geographical contributions. Vegetal geography should remain an outward-looking informal community, but one which is seen to actively contribute to interdisciplinary developments in plant studies. My hope in drawing these two fields together in this forum is that greater cross-pollination between geography and critical plant studies is encouraged. I began this paper asking what it means to hear plants. Rather than stopping at the perceived ontological otherness of plants and the inaccessibility of their experience to humans, I have argued that we should hold the shared similarities and differences of plant life carefully in balance in order to construct a viable ethics of engagement. Speaking of the plant as a who, not a what, first and foremost, a who, not a what, and redefining certain terms such as intelligence, sentience, or agency from the plant up provides a basis for empathy, a linguistic bridge around which relationships of care can be built. The plant draws attention to multiplicity of vegetal scales from, hold on one second, sorry, let me finish the sentence, from the individual leaf to the whole atmosphere, challenging our ethical and ontological framework. Give me 1 second. I have to close the door because there's a lot of noise going on. I don't even know what just. Thank you for that. I'm back. We must enter into dialogue with plants to imagine and create new worlds. And although this can necessarily only be drawn through a human lens, this should not stop us from trying, from experimenting, playing, sensitizing ourselves to the plant kin home. Listening to plants takes us out of ourselves, out of our heads, and our neural networks. It pushes us to consider the world from alternative embodied perspectives. Plants are already central to our everyday lives and social economies, waiting for us to recognize them as kin and collaborators in our co-production of ecologically sustainable futures. There are many ways to listen to a plant. Attune yourself and see what you hear. I like it. In the end, although there was a lot to cover, a lot to think about, overall, I think there was so much there to consider. There's so much meat in here, so many different aspects for us to go through. And I'm looking forward to hearing all of your comments. So please feel free to ask questions, to post in the comments, to ask, to come into the Naturally Conscious community and ask us about them, because I do think that Anna here like Anna Lawrence really brought up many different types of consideration, especially, like I said, the whole concept of plant ethics. I have not heard anybody talk about plant ethics from the perspectives that she's touching about. I've heard mainly people talk about it from the perspective of, like I said, the law. That seems to be kind of the most oftentimes that is really where these types of considerations come into play. So I'm kind of happy that somebody else is touching on this, and I'm curious, since again this paper was written in 2021, what happens from here? Where do we go with vegetal geography from here? So I'd love to continue to have this conversation with you. Please come, and again, if you're new to this beautiful channel, please like, subscribe, share, add your comments, your questions. If you have a paper that you want me to review, please let me know about it. And come on over to the Naturally Conscious community, to our sacred, safe space for having these types of conversations on multiple scales, looking at it from an academic perspective, but also from a very down-to-earth home perspective. We really look at it at 360 degrees, and this is the place where we want to have these conversations with you. I think it's time for us to close this up. What do you think? I mean, I think we've been going for a long time, and I think we've had some amazing conversations with this paper. I'm really looking forward to all of your feedback, and I'll be back here next week. Next week, we're going to be a little bit later because in the Plant Wisdom Book Club, we are having our first conversation of Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, talking about art and gardening from way back when. So we're going to have our first conversation of Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, which is the book that we're currently reading from August to September. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what others have to say about this book. And so because of that, we will have that a little bit earlier. And then afterwards, I will be here with you, continuing on with our plant consciousness commentary. I am very grateful to have you here. I am so grateful for everything that we've been able to talk about, and I am looking forward to continuing on these conversations. So please feel free to drop me a line, let me know, what you thought. And if you have another paper, like I said, I'd love to speak to you about it. So that being said, I think we are at the end. I don't even know why I just put that on. It was right there. We're at the end. So remember, for everybody, resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. This is me, Tigrea Gardenia. I'm out. Thank you.